Hello and welcome to Background Briefing. This week we're revisiting one of our most popular stories of the year, the high price of power. Now that the carbon tax is dead, the question is, will your power bills come down? The reporter is Jess Hill.
Never has it been more expensive to turn on your appliances. In the last few years, our power bills have doubled, making Australia's electricity prices some of the highest in the developed world. Prime Minister Tony Abbott blames two things, the carbon tax and the Renewable Energy Target. He says that's why the government is reviewing the target again.
One of the things that we'll be looking at is the impact of renewable energy on power prices, because not only is the carbon tax adding about 9% to everyone's power bills, and we're going to get rid of that as quickly as we can, renewable energy targets are also significantly driving up power prices right now.
The Australian Energy Markets Commission says the renewable energy target adds 4% to the average electricity bill. For an average household, that's about $1 a week. If you take the 9% increase due to the carbon price and add 4% from the renewable energy target, you get 13%. That doesn't explain why our bills have risen by around 100%. So why have prices become so high?
I just always got my bill and thought, wow, that's gone up a lot, but that's life. I really hadn't looked into it too closely until I started digging away.
One man who's helped expose the true story behind the price hikes is Bruce Robertson, a financial analyst turned farmer who lives on the mid-north coast of New South Wales.
Once you dug away, what you found was that much of the rhetoric out there from politicians and people in the industry simply wasn't adding up to what the numbers were showing. So while many of the politicians out there are going on about carbon tax and green schemes, look, they're all factors in the rise of electricity prices, but they're not the main game. The main game is the network.
The network Bruce Robertson is talking about is the system of poles and wires that brings electricity to our homes. Since 2009, network companies have spent $45 billion upgrading and extending those poles and wires. And every dollar is being passed on to consumers via their power bills. That's biting deep into the budgets of many Australian households.
What people have got to realise in Australia now is we've reached energy poverty. And energy poverty is defined as when it's 10% of your disposable income goes on energy. And an awful lot of our community, where I live, is at that point due to the egregious greed that's occurred within the electricity industry.
This is Background Briefing. I'm Jess Hill. Today, we look at the real story behind what led to the staggering rise in Australia's electricity prices and how the coal-fired power industry and the government are using that price rise to undermine the growth of renewable energy. In 2009, the network companies made a dire warning. Unless the power grid was radically updated, the poles and wires would not be able to cope with Australia's growing energy demand. They said that unless tens of billions of dollars were spent on the grid, Australia's east coast could begin to see rolling blackouts. Their investment request was granted. But as soon as the upgrades began, something unprecedented happened. Demand for electricity didn't go up, it went down. At first, people blamed the global financial crisis, but it was just the beginning of a long-term trend.
In 2009, demand fell for the first time in Australia's history by 2.5%, and the experts scratched their head and said, well, it's a blip, let's see what next year brings. And what happened is that electricity demand fell again by around 2.5%, and it's fallen every year since 2009.
John Grimes is Executive Director of the Australian Solar Council.
For more than 100 years in Australia, the business model of the utilities was the same. Build more infrastructure, sell more power. It was a paradigm of ever-increasing demand.
But a new paradigm was emerging. Despite the clear reality of falling demand, the network companies continued to say demand was rising, and they carried on investing billions of dollars into the grid. We're paying for that investment through our power bills. Bruce Robertson.
And our bills have basically doubled in the last 6 years to over $2,000 for the average consumer, and $580 of that $1,000 increase, so over half the increase, has been from network charges.
Bruce Robertson is quoting data from the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal. We'll tell the full story behind these network charges later in the program. While renewables are not having a significant impact on the size of our electricity bills, the size of our bills is having a significant impact on the way that we consume power. David Leach is a utilities analyst for the investment bank UBS.
Because the price got so high, it made solar even more competitive from the customer's point of view, because when you use the solar in your house, you don't use the wires and poles in the system, so you're eliminating half the final price.
The fact that solar panels can slash electricity bills by more than half means they're now an economic choice, not just an ethical one. The Australia Solar Council's John Grimes.
There are now over 2 million households with solar PV or solar hot water, in some cases both. And the projections really are that between now and 2020, about half that number again are scheduled to install solar. We're talking about a very large number of houses.
How much is an average household paying to actually install rooftop solar?
So, as with anything in life, you get what you pay for. But a reasonable system, average size system being installed around Australia is about $6,500 to $7,000. Now, for a lot of people on fixed incomes, that's a big lump to get over, and that's why the support of the Renewable Energy Target is so important. What it does is it recognises the carbon reduction of that system over its lifetime of 15 years, recognises that up front into what is essentially a point of sale discount. So that support is worth about $1,000 to $1,200, depending on where you are around Australia.
So the Renewable Energy Target essentially is paying householders to stop polluting?
Absolutely.
Until recently, people were also being paid handsomely for the extra solar energy they fed back into the grid. This is what's known as a feed-in tariff. But in most states, those feed-in tariffs have been cut and are now only a fraction of what they used to be. But that hasn't stopped people installing solar. Today, 1 in 10 Australian households get their daytime power from solar panels. David Leach from UBS says that means households are now competing with the big electricity companies.
Because all of a sudden the household's producing electricity and they're deciding what to do with it, as opposed to just having a choice of take it or leave it from your friendly electricity retailer.
Although wind power provides the majority of Australia's renewable energy, it's rooftop solar that's wreaking havoc on the traditional power industry. And this is why. When the sun is shining, solar panels feed power directly from the roof into the premises. That means it bypasses the electricity system entirely. It doesn't use the network's poles and wires. It replaces power that would have otherwise come from coal or gas-fired power plants, and it's power the consumer doesn't need to buy from the retailers. Solar doesn't actually produce much of Australia's energy, but it's the particular time of day when solar is at its peak that's causing the power industry the most grief.
Solar panels have got this great trick. They make lots of electricity when the sun is shining. That's when we like to turn our air conditioners on.
The Australia Institute's Richard Dennis.
When everyone turns their air conditioners on at 4 o'clock on a hot Thursday afternoon, we've got people coming home from school turning the air conditioners on, the factories are still open, people are starting to cook dinner, the kids are in the bath. We have enormous demand for electricity for these short periods of peak demand. And that's when solar panels are at their best. So solar panels are actually pumping quite a large amount of energy in during these periods of peak demand, and that's pushing down the peak price. Now that's great for everybody, except the so-called baseload power stations, because the baseload power stations used to be able to sell their electricity for a much higher price at 4 o'clock on that hot Thursday afternoon.
How did those peak demand days usually work for power generators in terms of their overall earnings for the year?
Look, those peak demand days are fantastically profitable for the big coal-fired power stations. In fact, it's been estimated that they make around 25% of their annual profit from around 36 hours of electricity supply. And now there's a new kid on the block, and that is solar. And from the coal-fired power station point of view, you couldn't have a worse competitor, because solar is at its best when the market is at its most profitable.
Electricity demand peaks twice a day, in the afternoon and in the evening. Solar panels are stealing the afternoon peak, but in the evening, once the sun has gone down, the coal and gas-fired power plants are getting whipped by the wind. UBS analyst David Leach.
And then in the evening, the thermal generators have also been hit a lot by wind power. At its peak, wind can now produce, on rare occasions, as much as 12%, 13% of the electricity actually used in the whole national electricity market.
The coal-fired generators are saying this is no fair. We've got these new solar and wind people showing up. The Renewable Energy Target is dragging them into the market, and our customers aren't buying more electricity than they were last year. So from their point of view, they're getting cut by both arms of the scissors.
Richard Dennis. All of this extra wind and solar, combined with a fall in energy demand, has driven down the wholesale cost of coal-fired power. But that hasn't made any difference to the retail price of electricity, the price that we all pay. We'll explain why later in the program. What this all means is that the big coal-fired power plants are earning less for the energy that they produce. That's because Australia now has more energy than it needs. And that's a big problem, says Federal Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane.
We're facing an enormous challenge in terms of an excess generating capacity in electricity in Australia. To be adding large quantities of generation into that situation has to be questioned. The review process will go through those things.
Well, pretty much for every kilowatt you've installed of renewable energy, you're taking out a kilowatt of coal-fired power stations.
Giles Parkinson is the editor of Renew Economy, a specialist website that covers the clean energy sector.
And these guys are panicking and they're angry and they're resentful because their profits are being eroded. The Queensland government-owned Stanwell Corp, which has 4 gigawatts, more than 4,000 megawatts of coal and gas generation, they did not make any money from their generation last year, and they blame it entirely on solar, because solar has basically stolen the peak, stolen the profit from them.
With energy demand going down and renewable energy supply going up, Australia simply doesn't need as much power from fossil fuels anymore. In the last few years, several large coal and gas-fired power stations have been shut down or mothballed. UBS analyst David Leach.
Australia doesn't need any more generation. If we have more wind at the moment, it will displace some other form of generation. So no one wants to be displaced in this world, and we can all understand that.
Isn't that the point of the Renewable Energy Target, though, is to displace coal-fired generation with renewable generation?
The original point of the target was that wind would be the new generation source. That we imagined a world where electricity demand continued to grow every year. And that's the part that's changed. So at the moment, electricity demand is not growing, it's declining. So any new generation has to displace someone else.
The Renewable Energy Target, known as the RET, mandates that 41,000 gigawatt hours of renewable energy must be in place by 2020. Now that energy demand is going down, the conventional power industry is lobbying the government to reduce the target. The Energy Supply Association of Australia represents Australia's stationary energy sector. That includes network companies, generators and electricity retailers. The association's CEO is Matthew Warren.
When the RET legislation was passed, it was expected that 41,000 gigawatt hours would be about 20% by 2020, because it was anticipated that with the continued growth in the market, that's what you would need to get to 20%. So now we've seen the market go south, and the 41,000 gigawatt hours, depending on your modelling and your forecasting forwards, could be as high as 30%. So it's notionally a much bigger target. So what that meant is that the conditions under which the RET was designed no longer exist, and we think the RET is broken and can't work under the current conditions of an oversupplied market.
Now, what the traditional power industry calls oversupply, the renewable energy industry would call competition. So what's wrong with there being oversupply in the market? Doesn't that just mean that as supply goes up and demand goes down, then prices go down and it's a better deal all over for consumers?
Well, I don't really think it's competition. I mean, the reason that we have renewable energy entering the market is because it is being regulated in. It's at a higher price. So if you want competition, then that's fine, but then you don't need a renewable energy target, and then renewables can bat on themselves.
Matthew Warren says it's not just the target that needs to be wound back. The entire scheme needs to be reconsidered. But there has already been a review. At the end of 2012, the Climate Change Authority reviewed the target and recommended that it be maintained. Their review was supposed to provide certainty to the renewable energy industry. The chair of the Climate Change Authority is Bernie Fraser, a former Reserve Bank governor. He says that just by holding another review, the government has ensured that the 41,000 gigawatt target won't be met.
Investment is actually being cut back and delayed, and I think because of that, I think it's apparent that the 41,000 gigawatts for large renewable energy power plants is not going to happen, and I think that's what the opponents, the critics of renewable energy want to see.
How do you feel when you listen to some of the political rhetoric around renewable energy at the moment? How does that make you feel?
Sick and disappointed. Policymakers need to look beyond short-term economic considerations and the interests of some of the big companies to longer-term community interests. And that's what governments are supposed to do, but unfortunately it's not happening at the present time. So it's a bit it's more than a bit, it's very disappointing that we're falling behind, and we are falling behind what many other countries are doing.
The Australian Solar Council says Australia is about to take another step backwards. It's predicting that the rebate for rooftop solar panels will be removed entirely by the federal government. John Grimes.
We know that the government is going to side with big business. They want to cut power bills for big industry, and they want to protect the big utilities. And the way they'll do that is to eliminate support, all support, government support for rooftop solar. And, we think that that's outrageous. And it's outrageous because solar saves people money. The only way that pensioners, people on fixed income, single parents, community groups can make a meaningful difference to their power bills is to install solar.
Background Briefing sought interviews with the Federal Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane and the Federal Environment Minister Greg Hunt. Both requests were declined. The findings of the government's review into the target will be delivered later this year. For the moment, the industry is trying to find ways to get more money from solar households that are using less of its product. All electricity users pay a fixed network charge just to be connected to the grid. But the network also adds an extra charge onto each kilowatt that you use. The more you use the grid, the more you pay for it. But it also means that when people use less energy from the grid, network companies earn less money. Now those companies, many of which are owned by state governments, are lobbying to increase the fixed charge so that households that don't use as much energy will have to pay more. They say that's because as more people install solar and use less of the grid, network companies are being forced to recoup their costs from a smaller number of customers. Matthew Warren from the Energy Supply Association of Australia.
What we do want to see is the way in which we charge for the connection to the electricity grid is cost neutral, so that whether you have solar panels or whether you have an air conditioner or any other technology, you're paying the appropriate share of the network that you're using, so that we don't have this sort of gradual but quite expensive transfer of costs between those who have and those who don't.
This could force an even bigger change in the way people consume power, says the Australian Solar Council's John Grimes.
All this will do will hasten people's interest in saying, you know what, I'm going to put in solar, I'm going to put in some energy storage, and I'm going to cut off the grid altogether. So I think that if these energy companies think they've got a problem today, if I look 2, 3, 4 years into the future, I think a much, much bigger problem is coming, and they're doing this all wrong.
Solar power's major drawback is that it can't produce energy at night, and battery storage is still very expensive. Until people can store the energy that they produce during the day, they'll have to remain connected to the grid. But another new development could change that.
It is the next big game changer. All the numbers and all the companies that I'm talking to who are involved in the space keep showing me data that suggests that it's actually going to happen quicker than everyone thought.
Nigel Morris is a solar business consultant who spent 12 years working in the solar division of BP. He says that by next year, we could see solar storage options that make economic sense in Australia. After that, he says the costs will come down fast, thanks largely to a $5 billion factory that's being planned in the United States.
The Gigafactory is a plan to build the largest factory in the world for making lithium batteries. And it will change the game. The idea of the factory is to increase the scale of manufacturing in the same way that they've done in solar to, reduce the cost. And the same theory would apply in storage as it does in solar, and that is, for every doubling of capacity, that the cost should fall by about 20%.
One company paying close attention to the development of solar storage is Ergon Energy. Ergon sells and distributes electricity to regional Queensland. They believe that within the next decade, it will be cheaper for their customers to get power from solar panels on their rooftops and batteries in their garage than it will be for them to buy power from the grid. Ergon Energy's CEO is Ian McLeod.
You look at the network in regional Queensland, we've only got 720,000 customers and 150,000 kilometres of network. It's one of the least dense networks in the Western world. And that's a challenge for us. So new technology like battery storage, energy conservation, distributed solar in our area can stack up a lot sooner than it does in others.
Last year, Queensland taxpayers paid $600 million to subsidise customers in remote areas so that they could pay the same for energy as customers in Brisbane. Ian McLeod says it makes better sense for those customers to produce energy where they use it.
We see in the future that we're there to enable an effective market. So we connect all the producers and consumers together, whether they're generating energy centrally or it's distributed, whether they store it in batteries, whether they generate through solar PVs. We see our business model as connecting those things and enabling the most efficient outcome to be achieved for the market. So yes, our business model will change, and certainly solar PVs and the accelerated rollout has made us have to move quicker.
Ergon Energy's approach is not typical. For most big power companies, solar poses an existential threat to their business model. They call it the death spiral. Bruce Mountain is the Director of Carbon Market Economics.
The traditional model is under threat from consumers being able to produce their own electricity through PV systems and possibly increasingly through battery storage and other means to delink from the grid totally. And as they delink, the pool of customers left gets smaller, the total cost of the industry has to be recovered on a smaller customer base, and so prices rise, more consumers leave, and eventually the whole industry can die.
In Europe, the death spiral has well and truly taken hold. Governments there have set ambitious renewable energy targets, and European power companies have lost around half their value in the last 5 years. That's a loss of €500 billion. In Germany, the renewable energy target is 55 to 60% by 2035. Earlier this year, one of Germany's biggest fossil fuel generators, RWE, announced an annual loss of 2.8 billion euros. The company conceded that it had waited too long to invest in renewables. Its CEO now has a completely different outlook.
This is the owner of these nuclear plants and the coal-fired plants. His dream is to put solar on your rooftop, a battery in your garage and a fuel cell in your basement. And that's how he's going to deliver energy to you in the future.
Renew Economy's Giles Parkinson. The speed of Germany's transition to renewables has been criticised for being chaotic and expensive. German consumers pay the highest electricity prices in Europe. Australia doesn't have Germany's high renewables target, but it does have similarly high prices. Bruce Mountain has just completed a study comparing power prices from around the world.
It found that electricity prices paid by households in Australia are at or near the highest in the world, comparable to those in Germany, which is near the highest in the world. And essentially they have doubled over the last 5 years, which has taken us from the middle of the pack to the top of the pack.
Right, because I remember just sort of anecdotally hearing that we had some of the cheapest energy in the world. That's a bit of a general perception.
Yeah, we have very cheap ways of making electricity. We have large, old coal-fired power stations which make electricity at a very cheap cost. But the cost paid by the end user, by the household end user, is not inexpensive. It was at one time, but it's not anymore. Now it's, up there at the top.
So if Australia still has cheap coal-fired power and it has more energy than it can use, why are we paying record high prices for electricity? Federal Treasury has estimated that on average, our electricity bills can be broken down like this: 9% for the carbon tax, 20% for retail and customer service, and 20% for the actual energy that you use. The remaining 51% of your bill is paying for network charges. The 4% attributed to the renewable energy target is so small, Federal Treasury doesn't even measure it.
So while many of the politicians out there are going on about carbon tax and green schemes, they're not the main game. The main game is the network.
Bruce Robertson runs a farm at Burrell Creek, west of Taree in New South Wales. Before he turned his hand to farming, he worked as a financial analyst. At the end of 2011, 2 years after network companies began investing billions of dollars into the grid, Bruce Robertson received a letter from Transgrid, the state-owned network company, saying they were planning to build a major transmission line through his farm. Transgrid said the area needed the new transmission line because of a sharp increase in local energy demand.
Well, they were telling us that they were building these power lines to cater for this massive increase in demand, and we just simply couldn't see that increase. I had been a voluntary judge of the Manning Valley Business Awards, and I had a very good idea of what was going on in our local community in the business side of things, and I couldn't see much in the way of increasing demand that they were talking about. In fact, I could actually see a fair bit going the other way.
Bruce Robertson and a group of locals decided to do their own research.
There was this amazing amount of information, but it was very complex and hard to digest. And when you got to the bottom of it, the electricity industry was saying nationally that demand was rising, when in fact demand was falling.
What are you thinking at this point?
Well, I think there was kind of like a few, if you like, light bulb moments in the campaign against Transgrid, and one of those very definitely was when we discovered the way they were paid. These electricity distribution and transmission companies that build the poles and the wires around the state and nation are paid purely based on their assets. They're not paid on the amount of electricity delivered, they're not paid on the efficiency of doing that, they're only paid on their assets. So if they build more, they get paid more. And once we'd worked that out, we realised what the incentive was for them to push a power line down our valley when there's no demand, because they get paid more.
Who pays them?
We do, the electricity consumer.
What Bruce Robertson discovered was that not only were network companies allowed to pass on their costs of investing in the grid, they were also allowed to charge an extra 10 cents for every dollar they spent. That 10% rate of return was approved by the Australian Energy Regulator for a period of 5 years. It said this was necessary to cover the increased cost of borrowing brought about by the global financial crisis. But energy analyst Bruce Mountain says that the 10% allowance was too generous.
The evidence was quite clear at the time that the companies were able to continue to borrow money at considerably lower rates than the regulator allowed.
How much percentage-wise do you think was the difference, say, between the 10% that the regulator allowed and what the networks actually had to pay for their capital?
I could put a number on it and say, let's say rather than 10%, the number was 7%. But that doesn't tell the full story. The full story is in the actual profitability of the businesses, which can be established by looking at their annual reports.
The Australian Bureau of Statistics has done that, and what it found was that in the year before networks started investing in the grid, the pre-tax operating profit of the electricity industry was $5.4 billion. 2 years into the spending spree on poles and wires, in 2010-11, the industry's profit margin had increased by 67% to $9 billion. Over those 2 years, electricity prices rose by over 40%. In 2012, the Senate held an inquiry into the rising price of electricity. It was chaired by Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite.
What we found was those network businesses that earned the most profits were the ones that invested the most. So there was a perverse incentive in the system for an overinvestment in the poles and wires, and that led to dramatic profits for those businesses. But of course it was the consumer that paid for that cost of the additional capital.
Matt Thistlethwaite says one of the reasons network companies were able to overinvest was because there was very little scrutiny of their projections for increased energy demand. These were the projections they were using to justify their investments in the grid.
As a result, there was some evidence of investments that were being made that weren't required. We discovered a network business that had invested $30 million in a substation in Newcastle, and I actually visited the substation. It wasn't connected to the grid. The reason why it wasn't connected to the grid, when the decision was made a couple of years ago to invest in this particular piece of infrastructure, it was projected that the demand would be there, but the demand didn't eventuate. And you've got an investment in a piece of infrastructure paid for by consumers through their electricity bills that wasn't hooked up to the grid and wasn't needed. And that was an example that really hit home for me, this gold plating or overinvestment that was leading to increases in electricity prices. That was the only one that we physically viewed, but there was much evidence before the committee that investments like that were being made throughout Australia.
Matt Thistlethwaite. After months of vigorous campaigning by Bruce Robertson and his community, the New South Wales government agreed to look more closely at Transgrid's proposal in his area.
In the end, there was a whole inquiry into the energy needs of the mid-north coast run by an ex-Macquarie banker, Robert Rowlandson, and to be honest, when that was announced, I was very sceptical about the outcome of it, but on reading his report, pretty much to a word, he backed up our key contentions. Peak demand was falling, not rising. The general demand was falling, not rising. The demand in our area was falling, not rising. And once that had been uncovered, he basically said he failed to see the justification for the large power line project that Transgrid were proposing down our valley, and the project was pulled.
That project, the Stroud to Lansdowne transmission line, was worth $160 million. So how much of the total $45 billion invested in the grid wasn't necessary? Energy analyst Bruce Mountain says the figure is substantial.
I would estimate as an aggregate across the national electricity market, perhaps at least a half of that total spend was not actually necessary, but it does vary by state.
Is it not necessary in hindsight, or were network companies arguably aware that it was not necessary at the time that they were making these investments?
I would argue quite strongly it was not necessary at the time that they sought the expenditure, that the expenditure was not just about a disinterested pursuit of expansion of the grid to meet consumers' needs, but rather that a large proportion of it was driven by a pursuit of higher profitability.
The next 5-year period of investment in the grid will be approved later this year. The Australian Energy Regulator says the spend this time round will be far less than it was over the last 5 years, thanks largely to the reduction in demand that's followed the mass installation of solar and the decline in manufacturing. But Bruce Robertson says the damage has already been done. Consumers will be paying off the last round of investment for years to come, and for many, the costs are becoming too much to bear.
What people have got to realise in Australia now is we've reached energy poverty, and energy poverty is defined as when it's 10% of your disposable income goes on energy. And an awful lot of our community, where I live, is at that point.
Are many people in your community investigating other options like solar?
Yes, solar is definitely becoming more prevalent, particularly for people that are building a new house now. There's a very real choice, and a lot of people are making the choice, I'm going to just have a standalone system. And there are a lot of standalone systems now in our area, and increasingly people will unplug from the grid.
Solar energy in Australia is being produced almost exclusively on rooftops. There are no large-scale solar farms connected to the national electricity market. Giles Parkinson.
Look, Australia ranks about 23, 24 in the world on large-scale solar, just behind Puerto Rico and just ahead of Mozambique and Guam. It's really quite an embarrassment because we've actually developed most of these technologies.
Just outside of Canberra, a solar farm is being built that will be the first to connect to the grid. It's being developed as part of the ACT's ambitious target of 90% renewable energy by 2020. Background Briefing met the ACT's Energy Minister, Simon Corbell, at the Royalla Solar Farm.
So we're looking down the valley here near Royalla on the Monero Highway, just south of Tuggeranong. And in front of us is the photovoltaic solar farm, which is being built by the Spanish company FRV. This will be the largest PV solar farm to become operational in Australia when it's finished later this year.
How big is it going to be in terms of megawatts by the time it's built?
So this is a 20 megawatt facility. That's about enough power, the equivalent power needs of about 5,000 average Canberra homes, and it's part of our scheme to switch to 90% renewables for our city.
Often you hear the criticism of renewable energy is that it can't provide baseload power, and that's power that runs 24/7. Is that why Canberra's going for 90% renewables rather than 100%?
There's certainly recognition that there'll always be a component that needs to be met from other sources, but the argument with baseload power really needs to be properly understood. The issue with renewables is that it reduces demand, particularly at peak times, and it reduces the need to build more baseload power.
So how do you feel when the political debate around renewables is so centred around price, when you're going for a 90% renewable target?
It can be very frustrating. For me, it simply means we have to demonstrate how renewables are affordable and can be achieved at scale. Here in Canberra, 90% renewables, the cost of that policy is about $4 per household per week. But that's offset by about $4 per household per week due to energy efficiency schemes that are currently being deployed here in the ACT. So I think we're able to demonstrate that the cost of renewables is entirely manageable. I think what I'm most excited about is showing people that this is possible. People can't do what they can't imagine. And the opportunity here in the ACT is to demonstrate what can actually be achieved and what you can do, and that it is affordable and that it is achievable, and that if a small place like the ACT can do it, surely the rest of Australia can.